Another conversation on Let's Talk Leadership. And what we're going to do today, we've been having a bit of a discussion about it, is call this conversation does one size fit everyone? I think was what we agreed, or some words to that effect. But we're going to be looking at personality assessments, following on the conversation we had with Lisa Dunbar last week. And joining us are friends and colleagues, all of whom use personality assessments in their work. So Phil's joining us today from the north of England, Phil Donaldson. Kate is joining us, as she did last week, from Spain. We've got Tim joining us from Germany, Britt joining us from Holland, and Ian and I are, as is Phil, back in the UK. So it's great to see everyone. If you're listening live, then as always, just join in the conversation, ask questions. But we're going to try and take some of the conversations we started last week and do a little bit of a deeper dive, and particularly reflecting on younger people in a situation where maybe they're struggling to find a role, a purpose, a job that really fits them, that they find rewarding and that they're energized by. We're going to get possibly into various bits of technical discussion, in which case we're going to try and make sure that we don't get too technical and we keep it as simple as we can. And Phil has volunteered as a psychologist to keep us on the straight and narrow a little bit in one or two of these terms that get bandied around. And the rest of us will do our best to make sense from our perspective. So it's great for everyone to join us. And so, I don't know, where are we going to kick off, team? Where are we going to start? Shall we just start by saying that I think, Katie, you used the term, the Great Resignation. So what's that about?
Well, it's as far as I understand, it's a term that's been coined, I would say, probably in the last 3 to 6 months, not much more. And what's happening in organizations is that people are just leaving in their droves, and nobody is really understanding why. What is it that they're unhappy with, or what are they being attracted to? Is it more something are they being pulled or are they being pushed? But there's some level of dissatisfaction with the current state. And so people are moving. They're voting with their feet, as we say. And organizations are really, really struggling to find people to fit jobs and to fill those places. And it's happening, as far as I understand, across industries, from the hospitality industry to the manufacturing industry to banks to the whole lot. I mean, and you just start thinking, well, where are all these people going? And I read something the other day that there's like a silent revolution, and everybody's just doing a stay home. And so you think, what on earth is going on here? That, I think, is in a nutshell a little bit about the big resignation.
And I know we were chatting earlier about how the pandemic plays into this, and some of the things that have been happening that we've noticed particularly when perhaps we've been working with colleagues and participants on programs and looking at their personality assessments and seeing how things like that might have changed a little. So would anyone like to sort of just throw their 3 pennies worth into that sort of element of what we've been discussing about?
So can I flag it up first of all to make sure we talk about the right thing, not the wrong thing? So because it begs the question straight away, can our personality change? And I think that's a bit of a rabbit hole that we can go down and debate during the next hour, because it would very quickly turn into, well, are you born with the character you've got, or does it change over time, and can you change it yourself? And to be honest, people have debated that for a long time, are still debating it, have reached various positions which have changed over time. And I think it's better to think of it just in terms of, well, are you hardwired in a particular way, or do you have license to change over that? Probably the best conclusion to reach is yes, both. and it's the debate worth having to find out which it's more of or less of. It is probably not worth having, because you then decide, okay, well, I'm stuck with this, so that excuses the way I do this, or actually I can change in any direction I want. But isn't it interesting that as a untidy person, I'm going to find it more difficult to be tidy, and it does then get into, well, actually, changing that or being deliberate about it is possibly taking more effort, and that might be what's going on with the Great Resignation, is that people are looking at the way in which they're reflecting on what they're doing and saying, well, does this fit with the sort of person I am? They're not saying, does this fit with the sort of person I was born as? And neither are they saying, does this fit with the person that I would like to be? I think that they are just looking at it in terms of I enjoy doing this more. It's been a great effort to do that, and so I'd like to find something that I don't have to make as great an effort to do. So I know, but let's not have that debate.
Yeah. And I think if we bring it back to personality assessments, I mean, ultimately, that means it's a questionnaire that you fill out about yourself almost all the time.
Yeah.
And of course, it's always going to be the case that there is some bias there that probably comes out. When I say bias, it might be something conscious that you're filling it out according to something that you want to be. It might be a little bit more below the surface. Everybody knows that if you fill out a questionnaire when you're very tired and you've had a tough day at work, the results might be different to if you were to fill it out, say, over the weekend or something like that, depending on what your weekends look like, I suppose. So I think it's also interesting to think about how 19, almost 20 months of pandemic might affect how people self-report as well, because it's not just an inconvenience over a few weeks or something like that. It's really something quite fundamental in everyone's life, I think. I mean, when we look back decades to come or whatever it happens to be, I mean, the pandemic will always be a story that we talk about. So how that has impacted your self-reporting, how you report on yourself, fill out the questionnaire, in other words, is really a topic worth looking at. And I've definitely realized, having had the opportunity to do Workplace Big Five again, which we were talking about last week, that there are some changes, and I'm pretty sure it's pandemic driven. But maybe we can also share a few other ideas on that.
Well, one of the things that I've noticed, and it's not scientific, I've just sort of noticed it in some of the groups I've been working with, is they have genuinely struggled to make decisions or found it more difficult to make decisions. And when we've explored it, a number of things seem to come into play. One, that certainly on the consolidation scale on Workplace Big Five, there is a movement away from almost being sort of totally focused on one thing and very specific, because the nature of life is that we're now having to deal with a lot of different issues at the same time. And so that's one thing I've noticed. And the other is that people have become, certainly yesterday we were having a conversation where people have become more cautious, because there seems to be even more issues now that one has to take into consideration when you're leading an organization or making decisions about your career or what job suits you. And so I don't know whether that's a pandemic thing, but if I can think of, the issues that people are now talking about, and we've got COP26 going on in Glasgow, huge issues around the environment, huge issues around, do we really care about other people? And therefore the discussions about things that are so much more important than just us, that there's more emphasis on not just us, but us within the human community. There are this issue about people leaving. How do we retain people in the roles that we need them to be in? The shortages that have suddenly occurred in everything. And I mean, this morning in the UK, they were talking about the shortages of taxi drivers, for example. The whole thing, everything seems to become even more complex than it was. And I've noticed in some of the assessments, Workplace Big Five, Hogan, that I've been using, that just, I don't know, there's just a feeling that people are more tentative, more cautious, having to be more flexible, if you like. So they do lots of stuff, excuse me, but they find making decisions difficult.
Is it, sorry, Brett, go ahead.
Well, on the other hand, that might well be the case, but if people are leaving their jobs and companies in droves, that would at the same time point to a certain amount of people taking control of at least their working environment. And maybe that is something that they can still feel that they can influence, instead of the really big picture where so many things are going on that we need to be cautious, we need to be careful, we need to consider 100 million different things. But maybe the one thing that we can control and have in our sphere of influence is, where do I want to go to work tomorrow? So I don't know whether that perhaps leads to being a little bit more spontaneous or decisive or whatever, or have more of an appetite for change when it comes to something as relatable as your own job. I don't know.
Is it possible there's like an amplification effect that goes here, that it amplifies? So you go into a pandemic situation, which none of us, well, not in my lifetime, have really experienced in a professional sense anyway, and all of a sudden it tends sometimes to polarize these things. They become more significant or more extreme. So what could have been a slight, if you like, annoyance at commuting into a city every day, for example, to work for a big bank or some big institution, all of a sudden becomes a major irritation once you see the other way of living and working, albeit driven by a pandemic, which nobody would choose. It actually gives us an opportunity, which goes to show that maybe we've been faking it, or maybe putting up with something that doesn't give us energy, is not really a good fit. And actually, all of a sudden now we've seen the other way of living. It's a bit like culturally, you go and work in a different country, as many of you are and have done, and all of a sudden you realize how British or Spanish or wherever you're from, it comes to life, and you think, oh, hang on a minute, I'm seeing it differently now. So maybe the personality is a good indicator into why that fit may not be as good as you thought it was.
So Ian, if I'm understanding you well, what I'm hearing is that maybe what we were doing before was just fitting in. And the shift now is really going back to what is true for us. I mean, I think the pandemic, we would all agree that it forced everybody just to put the pause button on and stop and think, well, who am I? What do I really, really, really want? Connect with our values and our own purpose. And now we're getting that adjustment. So maybe what's going to be reporting now is the true self.
Maybe.
Who knows?
Yeah. And of course, what we do know is, in one sentence, and this is what Dave Altman said, another guest on Let's Talk Leadership, we know that productivity is up and so is burnout. So what's the surprise about the Great Resignation? And what's the surprise, in a sense, about having discussions about, is there fit or friction here in my life, in terms of, how much time I spend in my professional life? And I guess that's a really, really good point. Yeah.
But I think, though, that picking up on Britt and Katie's point, I think the challenge is that people know what they don't want, but I don't know that they know what they do want, or even if they know what they want, can they find it? And that creates a challenge for the individual, but it also creates a challenge for organizations, because if you're wanting to recruit young people with new ideas, fresh approaches into your business, then part of your corporate culture and your values and belief systems often might need to be turned on their head, or certainly revisited, in order to create an environment which someone jumping out of an environment they know doesn't suit them looks at yours and what you have to offer and says, that's the sort of place where my energy levels are going to increase. I'm going to get enjoyment working there. And enjoyment, I think, is a big thing. And in fact, yesterday we discussed the whole idea of fun, how important that is. It's this dilemma that people are leaving the job because they know what they don't want, but struggling to find something that does suit their own desires and needs and purpose. And organizations are being challenged in that, we've seen it. Oh yes, everyone's coming back to work in the office. Oh no, they're not. Oh yes, they are. I mean, I've been involved in those conversations with senior leaders, quite convinced that everyone is going to jump on the 6:10 from Surbiton and commute into London again, or get on the bus and get into Manchester. That's not happening. So there's a big seismic sort of shift happening, where there's a lot of people who are not sure really what they want to do and how they want to lead their lives. And these assessments that we use while very valuable and helpful, may be also perhaps under a bit of challenge as to exactly what it is that they identify for us.
Matthew, you just, sorry, Phil.
No, go ahead.
Matthew, just sparking in me a recollection of a story in a colleague of ours. And I just for confidentiality, I won't mention names, but the bottom line is that a lot of younger people, given that that's part of our audience here, are taking decisions that are going to guarantee their mental health. So we come back to this whole thing of mental health, and it'd be really interesting maybe to explore how that, when we don't assess mental health in a personality assessment, but there's obviously some link somewhere. And I think it comes back to being true to who you are and not trying to fit into an organization just because you need a job. But people are really taking very, very big decisions and saying, no, I'm not going to do that because my mental health will suffer. And this particular story is of a young girl who got her degree with distinction and cum laude and all the rest of it in opera singing. But she's not prepared to go into opera singing because she's under continual criticism. Her breast is too big, her breast is too small. She doesn't look like this, she doesn't look, and it's just too much for mental health. And so she's not going to be an opera singer, even though she's got incredible talent. And isn't that just amazing that people will prioritize mental health over the skill that you were born with, which years ago people were saying if that was the skill that you were born with, the gift that you were given, it would be a sin if you didn't use it. You must give it to humanity, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I was like, no, my mental health is far more important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things we're seeing is individuals making these sorts of decisions and it adding up to be a trend. And we notice the trend, but it's very complex because there's individuals who are making decisions like, my work is my social life, and I've just been asked to spend the last 12 months minimizing all of that or doing it virtually. And so I'm a person who is more extrovert or sociable, and this is putting a strain on me because the work I enjoy is not solitary work, it's social work. Or, it cuts both ways because, Ian, from your point, I could be a cautious individual and now is my time because caution is what's being asked of me. And so I actually enjoy this approach which demands that I'm more cautious about things as opposed to making the mistakes of being overconfident, bullish, some of the things that in the past have been demanded of people in organizations, that they are goal-centered and urgent and brave with their decisions, or that they need to embrace change and new, and they enjoy doing that, and suddenly now here's a change in the way we work, a total change in it. And I think from that, a lot of people are self-reflecting for whatever reason, making changes to find a bit more alignment or a bit more enjoyment in their work, and making changes in that way that add up to these big shifts that we see on a sort of a larger level. And I think one of the things that psychometrics has always done is help people with those changes just by describing the difference they have compared to other people, to be able to say, well, yes, you are unique, but it's a bit of there are a lot of people like you, and here's how they're different to other people who are not like you. And here's what they enjoy. That might be helpful or not helpful, but it gives people choices in that way. And a sort of a context of, in classic sort of psychometric statistical terms, here's a normal distribution. There are tall people and people who are not so tall, and there's an average in the middle of it, and you're on one side or the other of this average. And that's what people of that size tend to enjoy. That's a very bad analogy, sorry, but
it's a very good analogy.
Psychometrics is based on those normal distributions of people. People are spread across this, and your position in that is this, and that can give you a different view of what you do and what you might want to do.
It's interesting, though, isn't it, about the fit and about energy and about, can some of these assessments help us narrow down a few fewer options of where we head. Again, particularly if we're coming into the workplace, and we're looking maybe at taking on some leadership roles, or where do we go next with what we with our skills and our experience and wisdom so far. And if I have my time over again, I think I pay a lot more attention to some of the things that are pretty clear to predict around what gives me energy and what I enjoy. Because if I think about my career history, I've got closer to that as I've gone through. And I'm not only grateful but humbled and very proud to do the work that I do now, because I don't love all of it, because there's always bits that don't give you as much fulfillment, particularly with the admin side of the business that I run. But in terms of the way that we do our work, you get closer to that. I'm not so sure I would have been as aware of that had I fast-tracked that process. If there's any way that these tools can help people just to get better clarity earlier in their careers, you can maybe make a bigger impact in the work that you do, whatever it is, whether it be climate change.
And I think that's an interesting question. I mean, what's the earliest point in our working lives where we did a personality assessment ourselves and thought, that does explain quite a lot.
Could have been
I mean,
at school.
was it?
Yeah,
School?
it could have been at school,
It could have been.
where was there about 5 or 6 different jobs, and the careers master or mistress would say gravedigger, taxi driver, or train driver, or whatever they would have been. Why was it always gravedigger? Why was that always on the list? I don't know.
I remember those visits, but there wasn't much personality in there. It was normally someone just droning on, but yeah.
It was much later in life, I think, Tim.
Exactly. That's it. Or did anyone have the opportunity at the age of 21 or something to do a personality assessment? I mean, wouldn't it have been great? I would have liked to.
But I think the youngsters today, they're far more exposed to it.
Yeah.
As you know, I have a son, he's doing an engineering master's at the moment, and they did an assessment on what sort of engineering they're attracted to. And I don't know how many different ones there are, but which one gives you energy precisely? And it's exactly that. And so if that's the sort of engineering that presses your buzzer, then these are the sort of like jobs you should be going for, the field you should be going into. So I think it's come a long way since our time. I feel old suddenly, but I think that it's definitely there. But and additionally, then we go into personality assessments, because that maybe is more of a career orientation. But I think underpinning it, there's something around energy and your values and what you really like doing.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I have to admit, I was very skeptical when I first moved into sort of learning development, in that, to me, and it plays out in my assessments, in that, I just thought a lot of this was mumbo jumbo, clever people sort of devising clever questions for idiots like me to try and make sense of. And I ended up, every time I did one, I ended up with a horrible report that said, your ideal situation is being a social worker or being a librarian. And I remember looking at it and thinking, there's no way I wanted, with great respect to librarians and social workers at the time, there was no way I wanted to be a librarian or social worker. Whereas I think now, I think that sort of element of some of those reports is nonsense, to be honest. I still think that. But what I do think is really interesting is the whole values and belief systems that one can explore through assessments, and what really is important to people. And I'm not talking about the environment or plague or humanity, but just broadly, what are the drivers that make them be the very best they can be, and what are the things that turn them off, or what are the things that stop them from being the very best?
Good point. Technical point here. So in the past, the way in which psychometrics worked with this a long time ago was to say, okay, well, all librarians seem to fit this personality. So if you fill in a questionnaire and it says you have this personality, you'd make a great librarian. And very quickly realized that that's the wrong way around, because that means that all librarians are the same and fit a particular route, and is very limiting, because every librarian is different. And very quickly became a focus on, I suppose, characteristics that you might have, which if you're a librarian means you'll be this sort of librarian. And so it didn't reverse engineer it to say, okay, you can do this job because you have this personality, but more or less was saying, well, this is the approach that you might take. And the biggest example I have at the moment of that is my self-report questionnaires. Good warning, Tim, I filled them in myself. So
they're wrong.
Exploration. And so I used to enjoy travel and the novelty of travel. And when travel stopped, it was a bit depressing. And I thought, okay, well, that's gone. And so what do I do next? And then dialed it back to, well, I won't be traveling for a long while, so I'll just put up with it and be unhappy for a while. And then I'll be happy again when I get back to it. And that's the old style of psychometric fitting what you do. Now, about 6 months in, I discovered that actually you can apply novelty to completely changing your computer system, which I did, of course, as you'd expect me to, because other people probably pointed this out better than I realized myself, that of course you're buying a complete new computer system because you enjoy novelty, like you enjoyed going to different airports and countries and you enjoyed novelty. And having that relayed to me, either from a self-report measure or somebody else saying to me, is just a good reminder that in this job, work situation, you can apply your approach if you think about it from the point of view of where's the novelty in this approach, where's the exploration that is possible for me. And this is probably a much better way to look at these descriptions of characteristics we have, just to, in a way, aid your reflection and not guide you to a particular route, but in you making that journey, remind you, as I think, Ian, you've probably been reminded yourself of, okay, I enjoy doing this, I ought to do more of it, as a sort of a guide for yourself.
And
So
I
sort
think
of identifying the cardinal rules that are here in all of this.
Depending on how some of these tools may highlight some of your preferences, your needs, or whatever the language is that we're referring to, you're not limited in the role that you do or the particular company you work for, if you are an employee, to just do it in a traditional way. As you say, you can change bits and you can create those things that you need in that role. And I think maybe people that haven't got the wisdom that we've had over years of fighting the system, if you like, can sometimes realize, no, you can change the system to a degree and make your environment more appropriate for you. And it may not just be in your working profession, it could be in your community, it could be in the friendship groups that you have, in the work that you do, volunteering work, or in sport or the arts or whatever, to find other avenues to enable the fit that may not be perfect in your career to also give you fulfillment outside of your work as such. And I think that's another factor to bear in mind, that we create those conditions for ourselves. We're not limited in those things. We'll always find a way. I remember the FIRO, which is another assessment about interpersonal needs. If you have particular needs for things, you'll find a way to express them and bring them to life, with or without the classic parameters in place for you. You'll figure out a way of doing it. But I think for lots of younger leaders, they may not realize that they are not limited by their personality as measured today, their needs as may have come from yesterday. And again, the pandemic can highlight all these opportunities, but at the same time paralyze people with so much opportunity. So if what I believed to be true yesterday is no longer true, what do I believe for the future? And now I'm worried, because if everything's up for grabs, what do I rely on next? And where do I go next? It could be quite scary, I think, for some people.
Yeah.
But how much of this is drawn from looking at all of us on the screen, the fact that we are of a certain age and experience, and to put it impolitely, we've been around the block a few times doing different things, as opposed to someone who's sort of maybe in their first role and having left school or left college and suddenly realizing that actually there isn't a fit. There's so many things in what they're doing that isn't quite as they were led to believe by their careers advisor, by their university, college, or whatever it might be. It takes an awful lot of courage to say, this isn't right, this isn't for me, this is not what I want to spend the rest of my life doing, and just move or walk. I mean, I literally had someone say to me a short while ago last week, I've got this really big job, and I've just taken it on. If I leave it, I've got nothing. I've got no job to go to. I've got commitments that have to be met. but I really don't think I can do this job. I don't think it's for me. I don't think there's a fit. And if that's someone saying it at who with a lot of experience, how much more difficult it is for someone a lot younger to do that. And I think I don't know. Go on, Katie.
No, I'm just thinking that, back to my jobs. I've had so many jobs, and some of them have fitted a little bit, some of them fit a bit more. And I think now I'm in a job that fits, and it just suits me. But I've done lots of stuff that hasn't fitted, and I think that maybe we might be doing a disservice encouraging young people to say, find a job that fits you. Because I think that the human beings, we discover ourselves through trial and error.
Yeah.
And that you need to go into jobs and, say, hey, this is not for me. How many of us have done a job and thought, I'm getting out of here as soon as possible? I remember one waitressing job, I lasted one night. It was like, that's it, I'm not doing this anymore. So I think that we mustn't rob people of that. Experience is a great teacher, and it's a great teacher for who we want to be and what we aspire to be. But we need that experience. I would hate somebody to fall into the perfect job at the age of 22, whatever, when they leave university. But so what that takes me to is just the worry that young people might be thinking that whatever they're going to do, they're stuck with it.
Yeah, I think you could over-engineer the whole thing, and I totally agree with Katie that you've got to discover also in a practical sense what gives you energy, what doesn't give you energy. And ultimately, building back on what Matthew was saying, I think if something doesn't feel right over time, most human beings will take some sort of action. If it really feels wrong deep in the gut, some sort of action will be taken. It doesn't necessarily mean you, as a big drama king or queen, that you throw everything in the air and just walk out of a job or something like that. But people will be, some sort of action will emerge in their life as well. And I think our job is to kind of give people a push sometimes, but other times just almost help them hold the steering wheel or something like that. Because I think Kate has made a very valuable addition there to the conversation. We don't overdo it. Don't come in like, a fireball trying to reorientate someone's life, because it's not necessarily going to be possible anyway, I don't think.
And I think as adults, we have a lot to be accountable for. I mean, I know when I meet younger people and I just say, what do you want to do? It's almost like there's some finality to it, isn't it? Isn't there? It's wrong. It's like because you don't want them to think that whatever they choose, they're stuck there forever. They're absolutely not.
Yeah. That's a wrong mental model from the past. Yes,
I think so. Yeah.
When you grow up, Katie, right? I don't know. I'm not grown up yet, so
exactly.
I'm still figuring it out. Yeah.
Train driver.
But it then also throws up a challenge for organizations. And again, one of the things I've noticed with some of the organizations I'm working with at the moment is how focused they are now on really thinking about corporate social responsibility, about employment of people, how they treat people. And although words get banded around like diversity and inclusion and equity and all of that, actually much deeper conversations than there might have been even a few years ago around how do we attract talent to come and work for us? What is the working environment that we need to create, maybe completely new, that enables us to attract younger people into our organization and feel that they do fit and that they can be at their best. And again, I think it's something that might have been a sort of HR background conversation for years, but I've noticed certainly in the last 18 months, it's gone from being an interesting conversation to one that's actually right at the heart of what a lot of our clients are now focusing on. That it's all very well to have wonderful products or a great brand, but if you can't attract the future talent to come and work for you because what you stand for probably doesn't quite fit with what they believe in, then rather than just spend an awful lot of money trying to find the right people and struggling to do that, hey, we've got to look at a completely new way in which we organize ourselves and how we promote ourselves and what we really pay attention to. And I think that's an interesting challenge for organizations. And then going back to, things like recruitment and selection programs, and then what do we use if we need to use some sort of analysis or an analytical tool? what do we use to help us make those decisions?
Are there some parallels maybe with the COP26 or what's going on? The whole world is looking at the moment about saving the planet and what we need to do. If we bring this right down to the leader's role at the early years of being a leader in business, maybe there's much that we have to take a real focus on now to prevent it reoccurring in future generations of leaders that get up to the top levels. So with our young leader audience, can we help them? If one size doesn't fit all, not just from a leader perspective, but from staff working in businesses, how can our younger leaders create environments where everybody can find a fit? If they have a connection to the mission of that business, how can we create or help leaders create an environment where they can all find a place to fit and get energy by not having to fit in to a corporate culture, but a corporate culture that can enable anybody to exist and fit? If they believe in that mission, I think that has to be a big part of the purpose, as we call it, of the organization. Wouldn't that be a nice way to look at future organizations, that there's not a culture that you have to fit into, there's a culture that is inclusive of various different personalities, where people are committed to that cause? Maybe I'm being naive in what's possible in the future, but wouldn't that be a great place to live if leaders can create that? So one size just doesn't fit all, and let's stop trying to force people in, but use personality assessments as a way to finding out what type of jigsaw piece shapes we have to have available so people can fit into those.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes,
Well,
it
perhaps
does. And it's a great reference back to what we're talking about, which is the one size doesn't fit all. And so I always think of this as being, so these personality questionnaires that we're talking about, who are they for? And we're talking here about, are they for the individual to help them navigate all of this, or are they for the organization to help them to find the best talent? And it's both, but sometimes those can work together in the same direction. And the one size fits all always reminds me of a very cynical message I had about the psychometrics in an organization, which was basically around the tidy desk policy, which was that you'll get on in this organization if you have a tidy desk. And if you don't have a tidy desk, you won't get on in this organization, which turned into being a particular characteristic that they looked for in people, which was that they were structured and that they tended to be organized people. And this limited them in terms of who they were selecting for people in that organization, because only tidy, structured, organized, logical people joined the organization. And they'd done something that, and it was pretty easy to navigate. I mean, as an individual in the organization, it was pretty easy to navigate through it, because if you kept your desk tidy, then you got on in the organization. And psychometrics wasn't serving them very well, because it had conflated two things, which was results and tidiness. And these things were not linked. And what we tend to do in our thoughts anyway is sometimes conflate things that aren't linked. And the biggest one has always been social confidence. We think that being extrovert is being confident. And these are completely independent characteristics. You can be not confident and extrovert. You can be confident and introvert. And if psychometrics has served us by separating and specifying things like that, then it's done a useful job. But it is a shame, because we could have done that for ourselves. We should have figured that out a long time ago.
Phil, you're triggering thoughts in me. I mean, the one thing that immediately comes to mind is the story of Netflix, when the guy who had, and I never remember his name, my apologies to him, the Rules, No Rules book. Yeah. When the story behind creating Netflix and what happened with
Reed Hastings.
That's it, Reed Hastings. When they wrote a it's like how to deal with problems for dummies. And he woke up one day and he realized that he had just dummies in his organization, because they had wheedled out all the innovation and the spontaneity. So whenever you just focus on one side of personality, you're not getting any of the benefits of the other side. And that, I think, is a really important part of us understanding personality, and young people also understanding. And it takes me back to this thing of energy, which it's new to me, the energy story around Workplace Big Five. So I've got a question for all of you who know possibly more about it than I do. If I were a young person doing a Workplace Big Five or personality assessment, obviously, wherever your score lies on whatever scale or subtrait that we're talking about, that is an idea that it's going to give you energy. But how do you start equating that to companies and company cultures and their missions and their purposes? How do you craft what I need to look for based on what gives me energy? So it might sound like a bit of a basic question, but I think that's where people grapple with, because when you don't know the work environment, it's like, well, where do I find that? What do I do? How do I put this all together so it's useful for me?
It's a bit of a matching role, isn't it, Katie? So it's like a hypothesis. So if you have some data in an assessment and you're looking at fit, you can maybe highlight a few potential blind spots you weren't aware of that may cause you issues or challenges in the future, and some great strengths where there's going to be a very good alignment between the business, the role, the culture. And if you use it in that way, it can be very helpful to people. But of course, it will never fully predict what will happen. And we should never take it as the absolute truth, because there are many other lenses of different psychometrics or just world experience that you have to add in to the mix. But I think it could help people coming into the job market, particularly as young leaders, just to see, not just for themselves, but for the people that they are leading when they have their first team that they're leading, to say, why is it that I get on really well as a leader with this half of my team, but this half really challenge me? Is it them? Is it me? Is it us? What's going on there? So
I think it can also be very helpful for job interviews, because I used to do a little bit of coaching for people around, how to approach a job interview and so on and so forth. And it can be a bit of a mindset shift for the interviewee to think about the situation as it's not just them being asked questions, but vice versa, of course. So the job candidate is almost interviewing the company to see if there's a fit. And I think if you've got this kind of thinking in your mind, and you go through a series of, they don't have to be formal interviews, but they can be early discussions. It might even be something like an assessment center that you have to go through. But if you go through with this inquiry in your mind, armed with a little bit more information and data, that can be very helpful as well. So there's no need necessarily for someone who is debriefing the instrument as a coach to know exactly the average scores for people who are working in, I don't know, the chemicals industry or something like that. But it's more as I say, almost arming or giving people tools to ask the right questions to explore further.
Yeah. I think the energy piece, Katie, is certainly in Workplace Big Five. There's a whole range of in some of the supporting information that's provided. There's an enormous, there was, I think Lisa's decided it's changed slightly. There was an enormous workbook that would come with the assessment. I'm not sure we ever used it when we were working for the organizer. Yeah,
there it is.
Ian's got it. And in that, there's a page which has lots of trees on it that have different sized branches and leaves and different sized root systems. And what it's trying to do, and it's an analogy, obviously a metaphor, it's trying to explain that there are things that some people can be performing really, really well, achieving all sorts of results, being the one example I think is in the sales team, they are the salesperson personified, but actually it drains them to do it. They're using an enormous amount of energy to get that result. And then there are others who actually have a lot of energy, but it's not being tapped into, either because they're young or they're inexperienced, or maybe no one's asked or no one's had a conversation with them about what they would like to do. And I think those sort of questions, forget the assessment, it's the questions that come out of these that are important. And I know I've said that some people I've been working with, what really energizes you? Think of all the things you do in your waking day when you're having fun, you're doing it well, you're energized, and even if you're a bit physically tired, mentally you'd like to go on and do it a bit further, you know, that you're not thinking, oh, I've got to stop this, I want to do something else. You're already in that moment, and that you don't feel drained by it when you've finished doing it. And then try and analyze what is in it, that go back to Phil's point really, what is in it that is giving you that energy? What is it about it? And if, you know, Phil talked about novelty. If it's novelty, it could be, as you say, novelty with computer systems, novelty with visiting new places, novelty with meeting new people. But what is it that gives you that feeling of being energized? The Workplace Big Five assessment, I think, is really good with that. And it also, it also shows in some of the sub-reports how things drain you. And then you can have a conversation about, but if those things are important to your role, that you find them draining, what strategies can you adopt to provide you with enough energy to be as good as you can, knowing that you can't keep it up for very long? So, you know, when is it important to make a decision that you know is going to drain you? What's the best time for you to do that? What other people could you bring into that decision-making process to make it easier for you to resolve a complex situation? And it's those conversations that I think are really important. And if you take Hogan, for instance, and Anne and I were using it yesterday, fabulous conversations within the senior leadership team about the differences between them, their drivers, the motivators, the way they behave when they're under stress. Real insights, not because they'd done the Hogan assessment or it was a Hogan masterclass, but because they were able to use that as a backdrop to the conversations they were having about why things go really well on occasions and why sometimes tensions exist and things don't go quite so well. I sometimes get concerned that we use personnel assessments as the sort of, oh, that's it, you know, we tick the box, this is who you are, bang, job done. And we miss all of that conversation afterwards about, well, how do we make sense of it? And what's the impact of it on your relationships or on how you view life or what you want to do?
That's really useful, Matthew. And I come back to young people again, and just the few conversations I've had with young people who don't have the work experience. And so for them to discover what gives them energy in a work environment is really tough. It's like, I don't know what the work environment is about. I'm probably it's going to be awful. So I'm guessing that doing the assessment and then maybe sort of like hypothesizing about potential work scenarios would be useful, because it's that lack of experience around the energy, I think, that's where the youngsters get stuck, because they just can't connect to it.
And I also think, but again, it might be my age, that young people need to be convinced about the values and the belief systems of the organizations that they're working in, or the societies they're joining, or the clubs they're in, or the groups they're in at university or college, or their first job, you know, whatever it might be. If they go into a situation where every waking moment of their work, there is a conflict between what they deep down feel is important and what they see around them, then they are going to really struggle. They're going to struggle. And what I've seen is they don't struggle by the Great Resignation. They struggle by their mental health deteriorating, and they get stressed and they get concerned and worried. They're in their new job. They don't want to foul up. They're earning enough money just to pay their first, you know, down payment on a small house or a flat or whatever it might be, pay off their university fees, all of those pressures. And suddenly they're in a system where the beliefs, the organizational values are just at complete odds with their own views. And that is a very, very tough place to be. Very.
Yeah.
And I think it's duty bound on us and all organizations to recognize that and to deal with it, to help them.
I've always liked the energy analogy in all of this, because I think it's useful to think about it as being, well, there's jobs that I wouldn't enjoy or would drain me, or that there's just not a fit, and those would use enormous amounts of energy. And there's aspects of my job which I can't avoid, which do use energy. And there's choices I can make in my work which which I have to do, and I think of it as being a difficult thing, so I might avoid it, but I can do it using some energy, and it creates an equation, doesn't it? Which is how much energy I'm going to need for this, and how much do I want to use a bit of energy in doing that. I enjoy exercise; it uses energy, and I get tired from it. There's a paradox to that. But it brings you back then to, well, where am I going to get that energy from? Or where am I going to get the recovery time from having used the energy? Which does lead, I think, to much more practical conversations about career choice, where there is some choice possible, about the possible stress of not having choice, about getting fit for particular situations or for particular longer chapters of your career while you might be doing something, and about the practical end of, well, actually, I don't see a lot of choice in this. There are few jobs that are available to me, or I'm stuck in this job. But if I think of it as chapter, which is going to demand a lot of energy, how am I going to sustain myself with this? And I think it's a good analogy that leads to a lot of practical approaches to a lot of this that people can take. And interestingly, takes us down the resilience idea of some of these practical approaches might be quite physical. I mean, make sure during this that you sleep well, eat well, and get some breaks, or do some exercise. So,
and I know we touched on right at the beginning, you know, sort of Phil holding up his hand and saying, look, this is the, you know, let's get some of this out of the way. I think perhaps we should just emphasize that we're not talking about energy in terms of I run around, you know, the block 100 times and I'm rushing up downstairs and people see me as being energetic. You know, I've met someone recently who gets incredibly energized by research, by reading things, by looking up data, by analyzing it, by presenting it in spreadsheets. He loves it. He everything about it he adores. Whereas other people, you could imagine going, no, please, just leave me alone. So it's this point about what gives you that drive when you're really enjoying something, really doing it well. And even though you're physically tired, you know, having maybe run a half marathon or whatever, you're still energized by the fact you've done it.
It's like when you lose track of time and you're just totally absorbed in it.
Flow.
Fulfilling. In the flow. Yeah, that's right, Brett.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, Matthew, what have we learned today? So we've learned that one size doesn't fit all, number one. Number two is there's no such thing as a perfect fit.
Yes.
That would be the other one. We should be cautious about how we use psychometric or personality type of assessments in the way that we either recruit or we do job matching or whatever. But there's some good wisdom to be gathered from there. But what else have we learned today? I'm curious about our takeaways.
I think that organizations need to really look at what they profess are their values and their beliefs and their organizational culture and decide whether it's fit for the 21st century. You know, is the pursuit, I'm going to make a political point now, you know, is the pursuit just of growth and of profit and return to shareholder enough to engage young people in this situation, enough to make people feel I want to work for that organization because what it's trying to do is really meaningful and it means something to me. So I think there's something around all of that.
It reminds me of a 6-word story, and anybody who's listened to our other conversations, I'm obsessed or a nerd, but there was the one which was doing well, his organization's doing well, doing good, and doing both. Just take the and out. So doing well, doing good, doing both. And I think that's a great hint for future organizations and future leaders of large organizations to make sure we get that balance right.
Yeah, and I think the question is also should, or rather, what should an organization be like in the future? Because I think often when we're talking about organizations, we still have a very 20th century idea in our minds, because that's often what they are still like. Basically, you know, they are the corporation of the 20th century. So perhaps that's another topic we can take another time, guys. You know, the future of organizations, what will they really look like? We band around words like ecosystems and things like that. That's fair enough. But how can this fit with what we're talking about today?
Great. Well, we've been talking for nearly 55 minutes, which hopefully hasn't bored the pants off anyone who might listen to this at some time, but certainly I think we've all found it enjoyable. So thanks, team, for joining the conversation. And Tim, you're right. We just need to constantly return to this and explore it a bit further and a bit deeper. But it's lovely to see you all. Enjoy your weekend. And anyone who may have been watching or listening or does so, do please comment, because that's what this is all about. Great. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thank
Have
you,
a great weekend.